When people think of mindfulness, it can mean so many different things. The definition really is about like, alertness, paying attention, but it could be mean like a state of being, you're in a mindful being. But I would say a lot of people, when they think of mindfulness, they think of mindfulness practices. A synonym of mindfulness, I would say it's awareness or alertness. So when people think about mindfulness, it is often about paying attention. The definition that Kabat-Zinn uses is paying attention in a very specific way. So it is paying attention in the present moment, because oftentimes our mind likes to travel to the past when we think about what happened like 2 weeks ago, or even like many years ago, or pre-pandemic, or we think about the future, like what will happen in the future, what will happen like next day or next week. So mindfulness is really grounded in the here and the now. So paying attention in the present moment. And the last component of mindfulness is this attitude of non-judgmentalness. We tend to label experiences or memories as positive or negative. Like that was a good experience or that was a bad emotion. And so mindfulness is kind of steering away from that and recognizing that it is a whole spectrum, and we kind of call those like pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So instead of saying it's good or bad, which is evaluating, we tend to think of like, okay, right now I'm feeling some unpleasant experience. Like I'm being like video recorded. I'm feeling a bit anxious. It's a bit unpleasant, but I'm kind of mindful of this present moment. So when people think about mindfulness practice, I think people sometimes mean different things. But if we think about mindfulness based like stress reduction, MBSR, that Jon Kabat-Zinn, I would say mindfulness practices include kind of three different aspects of meditation. Again, meditation is paying attention, but the three different kinds of meditation is focusing on different aspects. Typically, people start with what they call a concentrative meditation. So it is about like paying attention to a particular like parts of your body or to a particular stimuli. So I would say most people would start off with like a mindful breathing. So that's the most kind of popular kind of mindfulness practice. So it is a concentrative type of meditation because you're focusing your attention to the breath. So you're just sitting and just breathing. Or it could be like, focusing on like a particular object or to the surroundings, kind of like grounding. So that would be the first type of meditation, concentrative. The second type would be open or receptive meditation. So that would be more like you're sitting and you're allowing your mind to just kind of have thoughts come up. So, and then recognizing them as kind of clouds in the sky or like leaves on the stream, which is another very popular analogy. This one is a little harder, people find, because I think oftentimes when we kind of sit silently with ourselves, like solitude, we realize how much our mind like chats and how much we start thinking about like our to-do list, our grocery things, and then memories come up, and it's really hard to just, notice and then let it go. So that would be kind of almost a second stage of like open or receptive meditation. So the third type of meditation would be guided meditation, and it is guided, and it can look different, take different forms. In this culture, we are very used to using our minds. Like we use our brains a lot. We analyze, we think about things. And I think our awareness, especially of our body, is a little bit less skilled. So I think about like kind of mindfulness is something that can be practiced. It's like learning a new language, it's learning a new sport. And so the more we practice being mindful, so those are the mindfulness practices, and there are formal practices and there are informal practices. But the idea is that we can hopefully reach a state or being of being more mindful. I think the last couple decades, especially with like globalization, with the economic growth, like everything has gone so fast. I don't think we are made to be kind of like machines where we are trying to maximize productivity, trying to be the most efficient being. It goes against our intuitions of how life should be. And so I think there is this kind of counterbalance of there needs to be some slowness, right? Mindfulness, by definition, is awareness, which requires intentionality, which requires like active slowing down. I think it's kind of like this balanced diet, right? Like with affluence, we may eat more meat and we need more vegetables or we need like more other things to balance our diet and our lifestyle. When I think of someone who is low on the mindfulness spectrum, so someone who's kind of mindless, perhaps, I think of someone who is on constant autopilot. And we all do that to some degree. We can't be like mindful every second, every minute, every hour of the day. For example, I have a long day at work. I come home, I open a bag of chips or even a tub of ice cream. I sit down in front of my TV and turn on Netflix, and 3 hours pass by and I realize I finished entire bag of chips and like the tub of ice cream is almost like finished and I've watched like way too many episodes of I don't know what Netflix. That would be mindlessness, right? Like you just kind of 3 hours have passed by and you don't really know what you just did. So that's a micro kind of example. But also, I think when life is so busy, sometimes like we just wake up and go to work and then we come home and we do all the chores and run errands and we may socialize with people, but we do feel like we're not sure what our purpose is. We're not sure like where we're heading. We're kind of going through the motion. And that can happen like month after month or sometimes year after year, where people kind of pause and we're like, how did I just spend my last 3 years or 5 years at a certain company? So that would be kind of like mindlessness almost on a more macro level. Mindfulness is really about the intentionality of kind of cultivating this awareness or alertness. So oftentimes people talk about being more grounded, like in the moment, even though like if I in the morning and I wake up, getting the kids out of home and packing all the lunch boxes can be chaotic. But if I can cultivate a little bit more mindfulness, I can be more present with my kids. Like I am less about doing things. I'm less about checking off like, okay, I need to do all these tasks, but I'm also focused on being. What kind of a person am I to my kids? What kind of a parent am I? You can maybe I would choose to be like a minute late or even 5 minutes late getting out of the door, but I'm a little bit more patient with my children. I'm a little bit patient with my husband. My spiritual director, she lives in the Philippines and she always tells me like we're human beings, like it's focusing on the being. We're not human doers. I think there has been a push from human beings to human doers where we look at productivity, we look at things that we've achieved and done and less about the person that we are to those around us. But again, it's not black or white, right? I don't think efficiency, productivity is a bad thing. I think it has improved the lives of many, but it is about the balancing. Like as this kind of technology, kind of machine culture has pushes the limit of productivity, I think there needs to be even greater awareness of slowing down, of recognizing who we're called and created to be. I think there's something that is pretty universal component about like paying attention and that cultivating awareness. We see kind of benefits across cultural groups, and we actually see that for certain cultural groups that, for example, I work a lot with like youth of Asian descent, and the culture is one that encourages kind of the suppression of emotions. So when you are upset, you don't kind of display the emotions because if I show that I am really mad at you right now, like I'm putting the burden on you and I don't want that, or I'm disrupting this harmony or this group like interpersonal dynamic. So I tend to like suppress and kind of not display it. And we see that mindfulness really helps with that because on the one hand, people may just suppress and just pretend, like I need to be strong for my kids. I have all these things I need to do. So you just put on a smile and a strong front and you just keep going. That's kind of the mindlessness that we've talked about before, too. And so that's kind of suppression. And we know that the more you suppress at one point, it will just come back to haunt you. And the other extreme, I think people sometimes is that when they're anxious or when they have like stressful like thoughts, they ruminate. They think about it over and over. They try to use their brains to like analyze or try to rationalize a way out. And we often think of thoughts as like sticky thoughts. The more you think about them, the stickier they get and the more stressed you get. So kind of those are two extreme kind of forms of ways to cope with emotions or stress. And mindfulness is the middle. Mindfulness is saying that we don't suppress, we recognize, we acknowledge. It is okay to acknowledge that you're angry or you're frustrated or you're disappointed. But you can have a little bit of distance, you're just recognizing that in this moment, you are disappointed at yourself and this is a moment. And so you don't ruminate, but you also don't suppress. And so I think oftentimes when people think of mindfulness, they think of almost this like, at least enough when I read about the popular like culture, it's like this almost magic pill. Like if you meditate, like then you reduce stress, you like reduce like anxiety and depression, weight loss, I think all those are side benefits. I think when we think about mindfulness from a deep spiritual tradition, it really wasn't meant to reduce stress because it's very inward focused, right? I spent a year in the Philippines and was very exposed to kind of like the rich traditions of like spiritual practices and disciplines. And when I talk to them about mindfulness, they're like, huh, we've been doing this like for ages, like, and they're not doing it to reduce stress, right? They're doing it for another purpose, which is to, to be closer to God, to cultivate this presence of God in the daily lives as part of worship. I would say like most people do it in two different ways of studying. One is to kind of study as a trait, so thinking about as like kind of almost like a personality trait, kind of as for you as a person, how mindful are you? Are you aware of your feelings? Do you tend to judge your thoughts? Do you tend to like think about the past or the future? So that's kind of just more about kind of you as a person, being like how mindful are you? And people look at how that as a construct relates to a wide range of outcomes. People have looked at like psychological well-being. We've talked about that as like depression, anxiety. It could be like life satisfaction. People look at relationship outcomes. People look at like self kind of esteem. So that's kind of one way. Is really to look at it as a trait. And other way is to kind of look at it as kind of cultivating mindfulness. So what typically people would do is they would recruit perhaps like participants. So for me, I recruited like college students or I recruited like adolescents, and we kind of like assign them into groups. There'll be a treatment group and there'll be a control group. And typically control group is they it's kind of as usual. They don't have the program. And then for the treatment group, they typically would go through like an 8 week or a 12 week kind of program. So it'd be a mindfulness based program that involves typically all three aspects of the meditation. So typically it will start kind of the easiest ones, which would be the concentrative meditation, and then leading to the open or receptive, and then ending with the guided meditation. With those programs, it's typically both a combination of didactics, but very experiential. I would say like a mindfulness program may differ from many other forms of like psychological, perhaps like interventions in a sense where it is less about, theory. Because we talked about like, I think we all know about the benefits of mindfulness, benefits of slowing down, benefits of, like paying attention. It is really the practice. So I think in session when I lead a mindfulness groups, like we are practicing, like let's do a practice together. And if it's through a practice that we, exercise our muscle and push it from the head down to the heart and to the body. And then we assign a homework. So it's kind of like a 12-week, where you really, as a community, learn and practice mindfulness. And then we look at the pre and post data, right? We look at kind of before this program, where are they in terms of their well-being? Where are they in terms of their mindfulness trait? And then we look at it afterwards. And I would say for most of my data is saying that not only do we see immediate benefits, which hopefully we'll see that, but we see actually kind of sustained like benefits of it too. So if we follow up with them like 3 months, 6 months out, we're seeing kind of some of those benefits. And we also see that these groups benefit the most for people who tends to suppress the emotions, who tends to avoid the emotions, who tends to ruminate. So if you're someone who tends to ruminate a lot, attending a program like that actually helps even more for you than for someone who has less of a tendency to do that. In terms of the methodology, it can take a self-report. Sometimes people do like we have parents report on the kids. And we work with the parents too, and we have the kids report on the parents. And we are now starting a study that we look at kind of heart rate, we look at cortisol, we actually look at, we're going to pull a hair sample and look at more like kind of bio data to see like, do we see a change? So a new concept, I think, that we're seeing in literature is the idea of cost of resilience. We think of resilience as a good thing, like youth who came from very hard environments or low SES. There are kids who were able to beat all odds and succeed, graduate from high school and college. But when we look at the biological or the physiological data, we see there are a lot of costs to it. They have poor health profiles. They have higher rates of type 2 diabetes when they're adults. They have higher blood pressure. And one hypothesis is that you're striving, right? You're trying to go against these structural barriers of perhaps perceived discrimination or racism, and you succeed. So behaviorally, you look like very successful, but then there's all these implicit, hidden, or invisible cost. We're hoping that mindfulness could be one thing, that would be one form of approach that helps to cultivate a healthier relationship with stress and healthier relationship with emotions without compromising the benefits. So we do see that like if you are primed to think about like, not just your breath or not just the present moment, but like what that means, like we do see kind of like increased benefits in your spirituality, like immediately. But my study actually found like that for the spiritual meditation, in the short term, like right after the program, people's anxiety and depression actually went up, and then it reduced like at 3 months and at 6 months. And this is very interesting and surprising. So I think BBC just have an article that came out that talks about like the risks of mindfulness, saying that like we always talk about like the benefits of mindfulness, other times when mindfulness actually backfires. And I think this may be one we need to look at the data more closely to see like, is it more for certain types of people versus the other? When you first start practicing mindfulness, you are now kind of like uncovering all these like suppressed perhaps feelings or emotions, or recognizing parts of yourself, and you're kind of feeling a bit overwhelmed because you're now recognizing all this, and yet you're not as experienced in having a distance, in not judging yourself. But then over time, right, then you're better at recognizing and not judging. So I think in terms of the research, when we think about the benefits of mindfulness, I think people look at it in terms of kind of intervention group. So people with either kind of a mental health, like kind of illness, or people with certain kind of heightened needs, and seeing how mindfulness program can reduce, whether it is an eating disorder, whether it's anxiety or depression. So that would be more like an intervention approach. And I think the research is pretty like very well researched, in a sense where there is lots of data suggesting the benefits across like multiple like disorders. There's also kind of like work on more like a general kind of like preventive like population. So people who are not like with a mental health disorder or not with like a medical illness, like those we also find like general benefits to it. When people look at like the outcomes, it is really kind of thinking about like behaviorally, kind of self-report wise. They're looking at physiological data, so in terms of cortisol, in terms of like health, in terms of like blood pressure, even like kind of like brain imaging. And the other last aspect would be kind of like how they function in terms of their relationships, in terms of their life satisfaction. So we do see a kind of across multiple domains that mindfulness yields benefits. There's now more and more study looks at like kind of what they call mechanism of change. Like we know that mindfulness works, but why does it work? And I would say most of the literature like kind of focuses on this construct called executive functioning. So this is kind of the part of the brain that helps like inhibit our impulses, to kind of plan and organize things, and also the aspect that kind of manages emotions. So I think it's really about changing the way we relate to our emotions. Well, mindfulness, when Kabat-Zinn kind of popularizes it, was working with patients with chronic pain, right? Like he he was like at University of Massachusetts, where a lot of times patients with chronic pain, like in deep suffering, and they find that the more they try to get rid of the pain, the more it affects. And so he's saying that, pain is part of life, and can you relate with pain in different way? Pain can look like a chronic physical pain, but I think we all have pain in our lives, like in the form of like emotional pain, mental pain. And I think it is really the mechanism of change is changing how we can relate to these difficult emotions, difficult experiences, difficult memories in our lives, because we can't really change that. Like things will happen, but we can change how we relate to it. And it is that relationship of how we relate to emotions then change that we see the benefits. And we find that this kind of like happy medium form of managing emotions seems to be a very good approach, alternative approach for especially like adolescents that we work with of other cultural backgrounds. When people suppress their emotions or when they ruminate, like their anxiety will go up, they will get even more depressed or they get even more anxious, and it may disrupt relations with their family, it may affect their school motivation, it may affect the peer relations or the kind of like sense of self or self-esteem. I would say that the difference between we call kind of secular mindfulness and spiritual mindfulness is less about the practice than the intention. So if we think of like let's say a Catholic priest or a Buddhist monk and an atheist, if all three of them are practicing mindfulness, from the outside they may look exactly the same, like they may be sitting in silence and being quiet and meditating. So on the outside it may look exactly the same, but I would say that in the inside, like the purpose is very different. So, for example, when I, being a believer, when I practice mindfulness, not only do I practice just paying attention to my breath, like when I breathe, yes, I'm focusing on my breath, but I'm also kind of recognizing kind of God and the presence of God who is breathing life into me. So for me, it's more than just my breath. It's when I meditate and when I think about my breath, I think about God too. So I would say that makes it a spiritual discipline because I'm thinking about and cultivating that reality of God's presence in my life. Mindfulness, the root word comes from this word sati, which means remembrance. If we think about mindfulness as a spiritual discipline, again, it wasn't really about our well-being. It wasn't about stress reduction. It was really remembering, like God who is in our lives, remembering the goodness of God, remembering His promise and His faithfulness. And I think that makes the mindfulness practice a spiritual discipline. I think of it as prayer. Like I did a 2 week like silent retreat in the Philippines, and it was completely silent for 2 weeks. We wake up, we eat breakfast, and everything is in silence. And there are pockets of time where we would all gather together in the chapel in silence, and that's prayer. It's kind of communal prayer, it's private prayer, but at the same time, we're practicing mindfulness. People do use some mantras, like when they breathe in, like you can easily incorporate it with like other practices like Jesus's prayer, where you talk about like, have like Jesus, have mercy on me, or like breathe, yeah, or be. So I think that's one reason why it is hard to, dissect mindfulness practice and just say like, okay, you can only do this without that. I think because you bring your whole being to it. Because I think if you want to be with someone, if I want to be fully present with you, it has to be in the here and the now. I can't be fully present with you or with my kids when I'm thinking what I'm cooking for dinner. And so that takes away my being, my attention. Multitasking is really like you're switching back and forth very quickly. It actually increases cognitive load. It's making you actually less effective and efficient. It increases stress. So I think mindfulness is kind of saying that, you know what, like let's just be simpler. Let's just focusing one thing at a time, but giving it 100% attention. So you're not constantly switching back and forth. And so I think that reduces the cognitive load. Is kind of highlights, enhances the quality of relationship. And also, I think when we think about the past or when we think about the future, it can go down a rabbit hole. Like we start thinking about all the regrets, even the good things. We reminisce about the good things, and then we feel like, how come like I'm not like I or wishing that things could happen like how it was 10 years ago, wishing that I could be younger, or you're kind of thinking about the what ifs and thinking about like scenarios, which again kind of takes you away from the present. For secular, it's really about, right, like you're not judging, you're just observing that this is unpleasant, this is, neutral. I would say that from a spiritual perspective, we are really replacing that judgment from kind of like, okay, how does God see me? I see brokenness, I see darkness, but in God, in Christ, like I see like renewed life, I see hope. So it's kind of borrowing that lens and seeing things in a very different way versus just, beating ourselves up, which we know, which we all been. And I think some perhaps like church traditions kind of, you know, emphasize that, like make you feel bad, but feeling bad doesn't really help with anything. Like I think it is this I realizing that you are broken, but realizing how deeply loved you are by God prompts you then to have hope and to have change in your life.